I'm going to call this meeting of the Community and Protective Services Committee to order. It's 12 o'clock and we have quorum. The chair is slightly delayed, and so I indicated that I would start the meeting for her. I apologize for sitting in this seat, but I think it makes more sense than logging in there and logging out and moving over. So I'm going to start the meeting by reading the statement that the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing, and advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or call 519-661-2489, extension 2425. And ask the committee for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. There are none. Consents, Councillor Slee, I didn't get a chance to ask you if there's any that you wish to pull or to speak to in the consents.
Sorry, Chair, is there anything that's pulled right now?
None of the consents have been pulled. One member wants to speak to item 2.7.
2.5, then pull it.
Okay, so we'll put all the consents except for 2.5 on, and I'll start with Councillor Armstrong, who had a question or a comment on 2.7.
Excuse me, I'm suffering a bit of a cold. Just want to, not contagious. Just want to ask through you to staff, again, this is what was at council earlier. You were going to do, consult with the industry a little further. Can you just give us a little update what's happening there?
I think that will go to Mr. Katolik.
Through the chair, we're going to be consulting with the industry and coming back with two separate reports. The first one will be with respect to the regulations around accessible services, and that will come back in approximately 4 months' time. And then we're consulting with the greater industry with respect to the cap on cabs, and that'll come back in about 6 months' time.
Thank you. Councillor Armstrong? Okay. Are there any other questions or comments on the consent items except for 2.5? There are not, so I need a mover. Councillor Sully? Seconded by Councillor Squire?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. We'll get that up on screen for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Thank you. That brings us to item 2.5, and I will go to Councillor Sully.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for presiding. Thank you, Councillor Ridley. I just had a couple questions. I know a couple of people had reached out to me in regards to this report, and just had some questions that I wanted to clarify. As well as I first wanted to express my thanks. I think there's some people from DIAC here, if I'm not mistaken, as well. And I just want to thank everybody in the champions who are involved with this and bringing this forward, and all their work and efforts that made this possible. So I think one of the questions, the feedbacks that I got initially from the community was when we talk about the 74% of the strategies being achieved, I guess people wanted to know on what basis is a 74% calculated? More importantly, ask why the larger question, why the larger questions, and sorry, I'm just reading a note here, why strategies proposed have found no place in this progress report. So just kind of wanting to understand, when we talk about the 74%, was that because of the work of the CDIS, or was those things in motion happening? And that's my first question through the chair to staff.
Do you have a question regarding the councillor's question? Okay, I'll entertain it.
Thanks for allowing me to be at this meeting, but I'm not so sure the councillors. What I see there is probably, you see addressing 3.2 already? Okay.
Thank you. I think that the councillor has some questions about perhaps a future item. 2.5 is the 9th report of the DIAC committee. The first committee meeting was adjourned to lack of quorum, and on our added, it appears that they had a discussion around the awards. Are we okay to move that, Councillor Salee, and save the question for the next item?
Correct, my apologies.
Okay, so Councillor Salee will move 2.5, and Councillor Armstrong is okay to second that. Councillor Usher.
Sorry, Madam Chair. So I look up there and I see an added, it says 10th report of the committee. I don't have that 10th report. Is that something that we have or something I should refer to?
I can see if somebody can get you a copy of that, and I'll give a moment just in case you want to think of any questions, but I have it on the added here. And as you know, the 9th report was a meeting that was adjourned for lack of quorum. The 10th report, I believe, was the work of the committee that should have happened the first time, and it was around the awards and recognition. That was the only thing on the agenda. Okay, so that was moved by Councillor Salee, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. That is for the report and the added report, and we can put the motion up on screen.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Thank you. Moving right along, we have a scheduled item not to be heard before 12:05, and I would like to welcome Mr. Oudshorn to give us a presentation regarding London Homeless Coalition update. So do you have a PowerPoint? Okay, we will change screens, and at the conclusion of this presentation, I will return the chair to Councillor Cassidy. And go ahead, Mr. Oudshorn.
All right, well, good afternoon. Thanks for allowing me to be here today. As mentioned, I'm Abe Oudshorn with the School of Nursing at Western, but today I'm here in my capacity as a member of the steering committee of the London Homeless Coalition, and actually very pleased to be joining you on World Homeless Action Day. So it's an important day across the world where we present issues around homelessness and call our communities together to take action on those issues. So you're welcome to join us if you're interested. I'll do a little plug. We are meeting at 3 o'clock at Campbell Park for our annual Homeless Memorial event, and 4 o'clock out front of the Covent Market for soup and bread. So we'd love to see you all there if you're available. The London Homeless Coalition exists to advise, shape, and coordinate community responses to homelessness in London. And we represent a steering committee of 9 members, and we have representation from the city. Thank you, Jan Richardson, and her staff who support that committee. We have a voting membership of approximately 30 members and a mailing list of about 430 individuals. And we represent all organizations working in the sector, people with lived experience, and other concerned community members. And so we go through a process every year of setting our priorities, and these are priorities that were set in the spring of this year. So you'll notice some of them have become a little bit dated already, but they are still what's driving our action for this year and for next. And so we wanted to come and share those with you so that you could know what the Homeless Coalition is interested in and concerned about these days. So I'll just share those 5 priorities with you briefly and look for any feedback or comments that you have. So the first is around income. So income concerns have long been on our radar. We've come before you actually before in our effort to raise the rates, thinking particularly about social assistance, particularly for those on Ontario Works. And the gap between what folks get on the housing allowance element of their social assistance and the reality of meeting market rent in our communities. We actually saw this issue come up again this morning in the Vital Signs report of the London Community Foundation, where they pointed out the unaffordability of housing in London. So currently, just so you know, the gap between average market rent for a bachelor apartment in London and the social assistance right now is $237. We recently heard from the provincial government that the planned 3% increase that was to take place this month was actually changed to a 1.5% increase. That's a difference of $11. It doesn't sound like that much money, but for this population, every single dollar counts. And so what we're going to be doing today at the Soup and Bread is asking folks to contact Minister MacLeod and request that the full 3% originally budgeted be provided in social assistance. So we continue to be concerned about this, and we hope that you continue to be a voice on our behalf to the province, asking for adequate social assistance rates. And we do know that the new model will be coming out in November, and so we hope to see reasonable rates reflected in that model. Our second priority is around drug-induced psychosis. The influx of crystal meth into our community has had a devastating impact on the ground. It has been devastating in terms of people experiencing homelessness. It has been devastating in terms of the service providers who are trying to support them. The shift from folks using other substances to using crystal meth, which creates psychotic behaviors that are very, very difficult to manage, is having incredible strain on our systems and services. We are seeing, as you spoke about at a recent meeting, more people who are sleeping rough. We are seeing people leaving the sector who've been working in the sector because of the impact on their own health and well-being. It's been absolutely difficult, and so the coalition, we are promising our members that we are going to work to find ways to try, at least in the frontline sector, to mitigate some of these impacts and some of these harms. We will be working with the community. There are other strategies we know, mental health and drug strategies happening, and we are here to be allies on those strategies as well. The third is the 5-year plan update. This is a requirement, and Jan and her team are leading this process. As you know, we have had for several years now the same plan at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels, which is wonderful. It's great to have all orders of government supporting us in the same activities. It's time for us to update that plan. There will be broad community consultations, and so we as the coalition are committed to supporting that planning process, making sure our members and the people who they support are involved in that planning. Our fourth is around an Indigenous plan. The first item is, you might be interested to know that London has not been a designated community for Indigenous homelessness funding at the federal level. And this goes right back since the start of federal funding, 1999. It's changed names and whatnot over time. But if you look at some of the recent studies that have come out of Toronto, where they've looked at other ways to enumerate Indigenous populations outside of Statistics Canada, had those numbers been utilized, we would have qualified for Indigenous funding at the federal level. So we are asking that we be acknowledged for Indigenous designated community support at the federal level. As well, our Indigenous serving organizations are working together to create their own particular plan for ending homelessness for Indigenous people, and we are supporting them, we are allying with them in that work, and available for whatever they need to make that plan come to fruition. And so our fifth and final priority is around voting. And so these priorities were set prior to the provincial elections. So we've got 3 elections at that time coming forward. We wanted to make sure the folks that we support are able to vote in all of those elections. And so we've been doing a lot of education of our membership to ensure that the organizations and people who work in the sector know how to support people to vote, as well as doing some direct education to the individuals themselves. I have to give full credit and kudos to the City of London. The municipal election, I would say, has the best process in place to support individuals for voting, so that if an individual experiencing homelessness shows up at a polling station without identification, they will be supported through a process. It takes some time and some paperwork involved in it, but they will be supported through a process that if they are resident, most commonly resident to that poll area, then they will be supported in voting. And so credit to the city and the clerk's office for making that happen. So for example, tonight there is a mayoral candidates discussion happening at one of our organizations, Sanctuary London, and we'll have a member there who will be giving people a little brief overview of how they can vote if they want to vote in the municipal election, and have provided those types of materials to our membership. So those are our 5 priorities for this year and for next, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have around those priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne, and my apologies to the committee for my late arrival, and thank you, Vice Chair Ridley, for taking the helm. Any questions or comments from committee? Councillor Sully.
Sorry, I forgot to take off my MERS. I had my question to the guest speaker today. So did you want us to formalize those requests? I know you were talking about that piece around, talking to the province and the federal element of it with the Indigenous communities and making sure, and you were hoping for us to be a voice. So I wasn't sure exactly further if you had comment on that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we have come intermittently with asks for formal advocacy or relationship between the other orders of government. I would kind of steer to Jan for which ones are most pertinent right now. I know the Indigenous designated community has been an important one. We are waiting for the new federal design to come through. It starts next year, but I'm sure this year we'll get more information on that. So we don't have any specific ones right now other than that you continue, because I know you and your staff have constantly been talking about the social assistance rate, so we asked that would continue. And then I look to Jan for any other specifics, for example, on HPS, the federal funding.
Ms. Richardson?
Thank you, and through the chair. The Government of Canada has undertaken a review of its national homeless partnering strategy. Some of the results of that have been released to us. We are awaiting the final information about funding, and in particular, whether London will be seen as a designated community. I wish to highlight that the council itself has taken a very positive stand and has submitted a brief to the Government of Canada to have London designated as an Indigenous community, and has advocated such at a number of engagement opportunities. Thank you.
Councillor Ridley?
Thank you, and I want to thank you for the presentation. I think when I'm looking at the priorities, they make good common sense. And wondering if you could review for us how these priorities were chosen. Was it kind of that common sense of what do we really need? Was this, through specific evidence, or just wondering if you can expand on that for us a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. So the coalition itself is an all-volunteer organization. And as you can imagine, because we draw largely from the organizations that serve within the sector, that we do have to prioritize in terms of the time and energy that we can put into this. And so that's why we select the priorities. The process of selecting the priorities is really a discussion across the membership. So the steering committee will come up with some, bring those forward to the general membership, ask for their feedback and any additions to that. And then from there, we do try to narrow it down to a reasonable number that we think that we can tackle over the next year or two.
Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's very enlightening. It's always enlightening when I hear something about the coalition. With respect to the priority number 1, raising the rates, is this for houses, as well as apartments and so on? Is this what we're talking about there? You talk about $237 is the gap right now, and with respect to the 3%, the government is bringing it down to 1.5%, which is $11. Can you explain that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, so the rate that we choose to focus on is the social assistance rate that is Ontario Works for a single adult. We know that the experience of homelessness is diverse and that families experience homelessness. Many people experiencing homelessness might be on disability support as well. But we try to keep this to a consumable information. And so we focus on the rates of Ontario Works for a single adult. So in that rate, there is a housing allowance portion. And so what we do is we look at, through actually the Housing Division reports its average market rents. We look at what is the housing portion provided through Ontario Works, what is the average market rent of a bachelor apartment, in this case is what we are looking at, and that's where we have that $237 difference. So then we look to the provincial government and say, okay, so how are you addressing this gap? What is your strategy? Our former provincial government had announced that their plan was a 3% increase as of October 1st of this year, which would have been, I believe, $22. July of this year, the new provincial government announced that they were actually going to make that increase only 1.5% or $11. And so we believe our ask is quite small considering the scale of that $237 gap. All we are asking is that they give the other additional $11 that was originally planned for the increase that they chose not to.
So just for my purpose, that I could be clear about this, the 1.5% is worse than the 3% because it's affecting the gap. The 3% would have taken $22 out of the gap. The 1.5% is only taking 11% out of the gap, so they're worse off. So we would like them to go back to the 3%. This is, gotcha. Thank you, Madam Chair.
First, a question through the chair to Mr. Outzorn. In terms of the drug-induced psychosis, Councillor Slee and I had the benefit of a presentation from the London Police Service about the situation table that they've been working with. How do you see that particular issue fitting into the overall planning we're going to have to do around community safety and well-being, which is a new requirement coming through the Police Services Act, but something that the municipality has to do, and it's going to involve a lot of partners. And what specific actions, what you said in the slide, I think was aligned working groups to make sure that we're all kind of working on this problem, but I wonder if there's anything more specific that you'd like to mention about that particular issue.
Yeah, so I would say that it's absolutely interconnected, that to understand what's happening in homelessness right now, you do have to look to the drug-induced psychosis piece. Because actually, if you look at the work that Jan and her team have been doing, London has been rehousing hundreds of chronically homeless individuals. If you look across the 5 Housing First programs that are in place right now, and you look at what was happening in terms of shelter occupancy, folks are moving home, and they're moving home at a quicker rate than they were previously. And so then when you look at, well, why are things why are the pressures getting stronger? It is very much related to that drug-induced psychosis because it has multiple impacts, including things like having people become service restricted, but it also increases the likelihood of eviction versus even use of other substances. So absolutely, in terms of the concerns that we're seeing on the streets that are leading to the informed response, absolutely have to understand the substances. In terms of what the coalition is doing, we want to definitely support the planning level. What we want to do, though, is provide tangible support for the individuals working frontline who represent our member organizations. So absolutely, we will be part of the planning process, but we also want to bring in, what are the tools, what are the best practices, what are the strategies, how can we ensure that those working in the sector are safe, and the people who they're supporting and their housing are safe as well. So we want to try to ensure that, in addition to all the planning processes, that there's actual tangible elements of support to help our members deal with those behaviors.
Thank you. And just two comments. So you'll be happy to know, if you didn't already, that we, in our pre-budget submission to the federal government, did ask to be designated as a designated Indigenous community, and that went through at council just recently. So hopefully they will hear that and it will be designated, because I think what we've been hearing from Indigenous leaders in the community is that there's actually a very substantial population here in London and many people who are experiencing homelessness. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I hope that the federal government will do that. The second thing is I wanted to just raise for you, because it's something I think is going to be an active conversation in the time period you're talking about, is at Planning Committee we've directed staff to start working on inclusionary zoning. And I know that that is a related issue. It's more of a affordable housing issue than it is a homelessness prevention issue, but these things are all related, as you know. And that discussion is going to happen over the next year or so. And I think you might want to have it on the radar, be discussing it at the Homeless Coalition, what kind of targets would be appropriate, in terms of the percentage of affordable units, to what extent they can be provided off-site or not. There's a lot of things there, and I think it's going to be a discussion over the next year or so. And I hope the Homeless Coalition will be engaged in that to the extent that you can. I know you're volunteers.
Any other comments or questions? No? So just from the chair, again, thanks, Mr. Outshorn. And I want to especially, focus on the Indigenous designation. And I know that if they're just using Census Canada information, as you know, it's flawed information when it comes to Indigenous communities, because number one, it is a Western style of getting information and getting data, and it doesn't necessarily suit the Indigenous culture and their needs. And I also know for a fact that the Chippewas of the Thames specifically advised their members during the last census to not participate because of that reason, because they're not tailoring the data gathering to a way that's culturally sensitive to the Indigenous community. So that in and of itself should tell the federal government that the data is not necessarily complete. So I appreciate the advocacy on all of this, but especially on that portion of it. And if there are no other comments, Councillor Ridley has indicated that she will move receipt of this presentation, and I'll need a second. And Mayor Brown has seconded that. And we can vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
Wonderful. So we can move on to item 3.2. Can we? Yes, we can. And it is the Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy update. So I'll look for Ms. Wilcox and anybody else. And I believe Ms. Lukowitz is also presenting. Councillor Usher, you have a comment? Go ahead.
Not a comment, just a question. Is there enough of those for me also?
Apologies, they're coming your way. If you want to toggle, there is a presentation, I believe.
Good afternoon, and through the chair, we're happy to be here to provide an update on the Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. And I have Ms. Lukowitz joining me today on behalf of the CDIS Steering Committee. So we'll have dual roles in this presentation as we go through. So this will be a relatively brief presentation, and these are the items that we'll be covering today. So a brief overview of where we've been, 2018 update, and as well as some other pieces in terms of next steps. So as you recall, the work of CDIS is grounded in Council's strategic plan. The 2015 to 19 strategic plan identified the need to develop a community diversity and inclusion strategy as a way to build a diverse and inclusive and welcoming community by supporting all Londoners to feel engaged and involved in our community. In order to develop that, the city issued an open call in 2016 for volunteer diversity and inclusion champions. 200 Londoners, reflecting a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, stepped forward as part of this process, and they became our CDIS champions. And a volunteer steering committee comprised of representatives from Council's Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Oppression Advisory Committee, and others selected through an open application process provided oversight to this, the entire process and the development of the CDIS itself. So CDIS was brought forward to CAPS last year in August and included these key components. The vision is that London is a diverse and inclusive community that honors, welcomes, and accepts all people, where people have the power to eliminate systemic oppressions. It also includes 2 statements of commitment, one for the City of London, which highlights what the city is committed to in terms of moving CDIS forward, as well as what Londoners can do and commit to advance the strategy. Priorities, there are 5. These include take concrete steps towards healing and reconciliation, have zero tolerance for oppression, discrimination, and ignorance, connect and engage Londoners, remove accessibility barriers to services, information, and spaces, and remove barriers to employment. As noted, it also includes a section called What We Heard. This it's an important contextual piece of the plan that highlights the various perspectives that the champions provided and heard throughout the development of the strategy, and also includes a glossary of terms. This was originally developed by DIAC. It was updated through this process and also is included as part of the CDIS plan as a way to establish a common and shared understanding around terminology. So on August 22nd, 2017, Council resolved the following, that the CDIS be endorsed in principle, it being noted that it was an aspirational document that was developed by Londoners who share City Council's interest in a more diverse and inclusive London. The CDIS Steering Committee was requested to report back with a proposed implementation body structure. Civic Administration was directed to report back to CAPS regarding the strategies in the CDIS which refer to or could affect the Corporation of the City of London. And a letter of thanks and acknowledgement was to be provided through the Mayor's Office on behalf of City Council to all Londoners who contributed to the CDIS process. D has been completed, and we're providing an update on the first 3. So in terms of a 2018 update, this past year has really been focused on initiating the work of CDIS. As is noted in the report, in your packages, 74% of the strategies have been initiated by the community and the City of London. In noting where progress has been made, there are some activities that are new as part of this process and have been initiated through the development of the CDIS. Some we have existing priorities or strategies that were in place, but they do support the actions and strategies that are outlined within the plan. So progress is being made across all priorities, and as well a number of CDIS-wide strategies have been launched. This includes collaborating with TD to advance the various aspects of the plan, as well as with Western and Cressy to work on some specific projects, which are some really interesting projects with Western students, looking at measuring impact of a plan like CDIS, as well as launching a campaign modeled after Edmonton's campaign of Make It Awkward. And I'll turn it over to Shauna now to walk you through the proposed implementation body.
Okay, so on behalf of the steering committee, thank you for having me. Just over a year ago, we were requested to come back and report on a proposed implementation body. And so we've spent a significant amount of effort and time having conversations, both as part of the steering committee and with the champions and the community about what this would look like, recognizing that any implementation body needed to reflect the vision and the mission of what CDIS is about. So the functions of the implementation body that we're proposing would involve broad engagement with the community. It is a community diversity and inclusion strategy. And so just like in the gathering of the report and the strategies, we want to make sure that in this next implementation phase that we are fully engaging the entire community in the process. It would also involve research, so looking at best practices around what these strategies are, what other communities are doing, and making sure that we're staying on top of that as we move forward. There's a planning component where we work with the community to prioritize the recommendations, develop work plans, and really significant goals that we'd be accountable for and the group would be accountable for and the community would be. It is a large strategy, so there is a number of coordination pieces that are involved, and so the implementation body would be involved in coordinating the work of all the working groups, as well as bringing the community together. There would be an evaluation component where using both stories and statistics, we would measure the impact of the recommendations that are going forward, as well as how the implementation body as a whole is working, and whether there are any changes required. And then, of course, there would be a reporting function as well, back to council, to keep you apprised of the progress, as well as the larger community, and once again, engaging residents and organizations in where we're at. And so this would include a detailed report on a yearly basis. The proposed implementation body structure would include broad membership that's open to anyone who's interested in supporting and advancing CDIS. Just as we did a broad call for the development of the strategy, we would do so again for the implementation body. It would be comprised of 5 priority working groups that reflect the priorities identified in CDIS. So I won't go through those again because Rosanna just spoke to them, but those are the 5 priority working groups that are also the priorities identified in CDIS. And so working groups would champion and guide the implementation of the respective priorities and strategies that fall under each of those areas. There would be a leadership table that would involve 3 City of London staff, and then 1 chair from each of the 5 working groups. There would be 1 representative from DIAC, as well as 1 representative from the Accessibility Advisory Committee. And then we draw on other resource personnel as required. The commitment for the working groups and the leadership table would be a minimum of 2 years. And we also are proposing a compensation of $2,000 per year honorarium for the chairs of each of the 5 working groups. And the reason that we are proposing this is recognizing that in addressing inequity through a diversity inclusion strategy, we're often drawing on people who already face multiple barriers, and recognizing that in a city-community partnership, that it's important that the people in the community who are doing a significant amount of work, which the chairs would require, should be compensated for that time. And it also just represents, I think, the importance of the work that the city and the community is undertaking related to this. So yeah, it recognizes the role of the community, leadership, as well as City of London's important role as equal partners in moving the strategies forward. And city staff would be an important part of the CDIS leadership table, providing some support to the table and the working groups.
So in terms of there was a specific resolution to look at the impact of some of the strategies and specifically how they affect the City of London. So when we did our assessment, nearly all of the 47 strategies outlined in the plan touch the City of London in some way, whether directly or indirectly. City staff will continue to assess the financial and resource implications of this work, and based on this assessment, a business case or cases will be submitted for consideration through the next multi-year budget process in 2020. In terms of financial impact, this is outlined in the report. In the progress section, it was noted that the City of London has identified funding for a position focused on Indigenous relations. This position would be funded temporarily for 2 years through the Efficiency, Effectiveness, and Economy Reserve. The compensation provided to the chairs of the CDIS working groups can be accommodated through existing budgets. And again, the financial and resource requirements of the plan will continue to be monitored and assessed over the next year or so. And in terms of next steps, the community, City of London, the various partners will continue to actively implement the CDIS. Work will continue to define the City of London position focused on Indigenous relations. We are currently in that process of looking at what the roles and responsibilities would be. Pending council approval, recruitment for the CDIS implementation body would begin. And again, city staff will continue to monitor the financial and resource implications of the plan and support the plan as required.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lukowitz, Ms. Wilcox, for your presentation. I'm looking now to committee and visiting members for comments or questions, or both.
Sorry, Madam Chair. When I was chairing, Councillor Salee had some questions on this item, and so I did indicate we would go back to him when we got to this item.
Thank you, Councillor Ridley. Councillor Salee?
Sure. I mean, I'm fine to wait because Harold had his hand at this stage, and I'll come back with my questions after.
Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank the presenters as well as the committees for the report and the work that is being done in this. I think it's a very important work. It's tenacious, it's not easy, it's diverse, it's complex, it's challenging, but I believe that it's work that has to be done. So I really applaud them for doing this. I look at the priorities, and I look at specifically in the report priorities too. I should thank you for allowing me to speak at the meeting because I'm not a member of this committee, so it's a privilege to be able to do this. I came just for this item. I'm a little, I have to say, a little disappointed because I don't see very much in these priorities that focuses or directs itself towards visible minority, racism, and discrimination. I know it's mentioned, but it's just sort of, and I don't mean any insult to anybody when I say this, it's just cliche. And I understand this situation because I think that what we have to do in these subjects, we have to be a little innovative. This is an old subject that has been with us for time immemorial. And what we are trying to do here is to reach a new direction, a new substance, and call it innovation for now. So I just want to impress upon that to make sure that we do not leave that part of it out. I would also like to suggest that some of the things that I see in priority 3, for example, that we are using, they're all things that we started 20 and 30 years ago. Again, I'm not knocking that, but I'm throwing it out because maybe there is something different that we could do. And I'm talking specifically of the awards that we give out, the Race Relations Awards. I know a lot about that because it was created when I was chair of LRAC. And the New Year's Honors List, it's about 30 years old. I think that maybe we need to come up with something a little bit more innovative too. There are lots of people out there doing things that I don't see being recognized. That's part of my vision here. And it would be really nice to see some of these organizations being recognized. We're just not doing it, and no fault of anyone, again. But I know these people, and I don't see them being recognized, and I think that we need to do something about that. And 2 other things very quickly, Madam Chair. I would like to recommend to the committee about an organization called CMARD. And I think that we need to work with CMART. We need to be included as CMART. We are one of the signatories of CMART. CMART is the Canadian Coalition of Municipalities Against Racism and Discrimination. We're looking to change the name right now, and I'm on the advisory committee of CMART, by the way. But we're looking to change the name, and we're coming up with a new branding that will be called Inclusive Municipalities. Okay, and the name we're looking at is Canadian Municipalities for Diversity and Inclusion, much similar to what we have in our advisory committee. In fact, I supported this name because of the fact that I wanted to have some similarities. It's a little long, but so I'm just throwing that out to ensure that we don't separate ourselves from this organization. The new acronym will be CCMDI, but it still has to be approved by the upper bodies in UNESCO and so on, because CMART is a Canadian UNESCO organization. So I wanted to bring that to your attention, and I wanted to not forget CMART, because we are one of the first municipalities that signed on to CMART 10 years ago. We're still a signatory member, and it's very, very important because they do good work, and we should lend them some of our support, and we should take some of their support from them. And lastly, Madam Chair, is to do with the compensation for the chair of these committees. I understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to encourage people, but the last thing I want is for some kind of fighting among the members to get that position and be a dictator up there. So I just say be careful. I'm not in favor of paying for chairmanship of this committee. I think it's an honor for them to be members. So I'm throwing that out for the committee. You may want to discuss it, you may just want to approve it, but I'm very reluctant to approve that aspect of it, just the fact. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Do you want to address any of the comments from the councillor?
Thank you. Through the chair, the only thing I would note is related to CMART. We did note in the report that we have initiated a community of practice, and at the time the report was submitted, we were around 23 municipalities, public sector organizations, institutions. I think we're around 40 now, so I think there's certainly an interest in doing that, so we will be sure to go and look at that and also look for ways to embed and encourage innovation in the plan itself and the actions we take.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Sully.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as a follow-up, not a follow-up, I started off earlier asking the question in the wrong item time, but my question was around the 74%, and I'm glad Councillor Usher mentioned it again. So if we were to look at what actually has been achieved since the CDIS has been initiated, what percentage of those items have been done versus because a lot of it, from what I see, seems to be stuff that has already been initiated as far back as from Councillor Usher's time. So that's my first question. And then in the meanwhile, could we get that, I believe it was the last chart up? Because I'll have a question on that one.
So thank you, and through the chair. In relation to the progress on the strategies, again, it is intended to reflect a point in time of where we are at right now. So you are correct that there are some initiatives that have been noted in the report that were not initiated solely as part of CDIS, but I think it's important to recognize, and we tried to do this through the report, that there is a relation between many of the strategies that are underway. Think of the work of the London Middlesex local immigration partnership. There are pieces there where the work supports the strategy. So it may be ongoing, but there are activities that have been undertaken that specifically support the strategies. I could come back to you. I would need to go back and look at specifically what is absolutely brand new related to the strategy. I don't have that number off the top of my head. But I think, again, it is so positive in that progress is being made, but of course noting that the work of, there's still much more work to be done in terms of addressing systemic oppressions and barriers that exist. And so it'll be a work in progress. And many of the strategies and noted in the plan, it'll take many, many years for them to be completed, and perhaps there are ones that we'll always be actively working on.
Thank you, and I'm not suggesting that it was intentional or anything, but I just think for, you know, a subject like this that impacts people on a personal level and it's very emotional, I think it's important that when we put out those numbers, 74%, I understand the intent, but then that kind of leaves an impression maybe in our community that, hey, look, we're 74%, maybe better than where where we were, and I think that creates some confusion. I think it's better to say we've only achieved maybe 5% or whatever, however low that number may be, so that people can know exactly where we're at. So based on this chart, my question that I have is, and it comes back to the working group, the compensation. You know, I understand why you guys want to ask for that, for them to be compensated. But my question is, who's deciding? Who's selecting those members? Is it the CDIS leadership table? Is, I guess, my first question. Oh, sorry, my second question.
Through the chair, the process that was envisioned and discussed was that we would launch a similar process to when the initial CDIS call occurred when the plan was being developed. So there was an open call to the entire community if they were interested to come forward and become part of the plan. So it would cover, there would be many sort of teams behind the chairs of each of these strategies. In terms of the selection of the working group chairs, this would involve an application process, and what was envisioned was that this would be vetted and reviewed by city staff as well as outgoing members of the current CDIS steering committee. And noting that it would be important to ensure that there is the relevant and expertise and experience for individuals that would be leading the various priorities and working in the community to do so. I think in terms of a selection process, there perhaps could be a couple of options of what that might look like. So staff could go through with the steering committee and come forward and recommend the members and make that selection process, or we could bring it back to committee with a sort of a short list that could be reviewed and approved by council.
And so to my preference would be is this has to be decided by council, especially in particular if you're asking for compensation. I think they have to be decided on by this council, and that's kind of, I strongly believe on that. So I'm not sure what I would do with what's in front of us, how I would vote, whether I have to send it back to have that question kind of clarified, or do I have to just decide or put a motion to make an amendment? So that's my third question. And hopefully someone can work on that in the meanwhile while I ask my next question, which is, you know, I think, I know I've said it in the past, it's always important to have our city's diversity officer here, the diversity office here. And I believe I spoke to the city manager, and he mentioned that the person is doing some training right now, which I appreciate. But I did want to talk about that office, because in the past I asked over and over that this office be still outside of the human resources function and be kind of a standalone. So I wanted to ask staff or Mr. maybe Hayward if that's something we can revisit, where we're at with that, because I feel like that still offers a more flexibility and functionality to actually achieving what we want to do, because I don't want to, again, as I said, as the person who moved in that direction to ask for that office to be created, to not be heavily invested in a human resource function, but to be part of this. And I know that has been part of the conversation, but I just wanted to ask again today.
Through the chair, that particular position, as you know, is in HR, and it's working on a number of functions, some of which are included in this, but really related to training the workforce, and in terms of eliminating a lot of the barriers, eliminating and coming against some of the discrimination, and make sure that we are an inclusive organization. So there's a lot of work to do in that particular area in terms of policies, in terms of training, in terms of keeping on the leading edge. Right now we're going through an intercultural competency training, which is, I believe, what the councillor was referring to. These are all important elements that contribute to this diversity plan. Working with the community, which has come actually through my office, and Ms. Wilcox has been doing that, has been going fairly well. Obviously, prior to that, it was under Ms. Graham when she was here. But there is definitely a focus on working with the community there. And then we've got Ms. Khan working on a focus on actually changing the organization and working hard in the organization through the HR piece, which is where it can have maximum impact from an organizational point of view.
Thank you. And the reason I mention that is because that was a decision that council decided to support. You know, that was $100,000. We're looking at adding, 100,000 plus more if we head in this direction. So then it becomes, when we talk about the importance of having an impact, I think these are all kind of connected, and they should really all kind of have just a little bit more clear of a collaborative kind of vision to where we want to ultimately get. So I really hope that we can look at that. I don't know if the clerks know or can answer this question. The last time I tried to bring this motion, it failed. Was that past the year mark, or when would I be able to bring that back? Would that be at corporate services if I chose to ask again? And I'm not sure if the clerk would have that answer here today, or Mr. Hayward, or not.
So to be clear, Councillor, that's to move that position from HR to the city manager's office? Okay. The clerk is indicating that she doesn't have that answer off the top of her head, if it's been more than a year or not. Mr. Hayward, do you have any idea?
I don't have an answer on that particular issue, but we probably would want to talk about that with me in camera.
Thank you. So yeah, so I was just asking that question for clarification, but maybe I will bring that up in camera, Mr. Hayward, at a later point. So my other questions that I had, I guess, was the one that I was asking to have answered. I can't remember what it was, but maybe someone will remember that question. Ms. Wilcox, maybe, to the chair.
It had to do with the compensation of the chairs. Was that your question? Can you repeat it again?
Yeah, I believe it was a question about who's picking that position.
Thank you. Through the chair, if the will of the committee is that we would bring forward a shortlisted list of names for consideration and recommendation to be the working group chairs, we could certainly do that, and we'd be happy to do so.
So yes, so Councillor, so you had suggested possibly a referral. So what I would suggest is that we go with the staff. A possible motion could be the staff recommendation A and B, and then a part C could be refer the issue of compensation of the chairs back to staff for more details.
Yeah, I think something like that, because it was the compensation, just compensation in general. So not saying, because I know I heard from Councillor Usher that he, had some reluctance around that as well. So I guess maybe coming back about that piece and the selection of the body.
So refer the issues of compensation and selection of the chairs of the working tables back to staff. So we can put that together in a motion, and when discussion is finished, you can take a look and see how we want to proceed. Any other comments? Mayor Brown.
A couple of questions, and then I'm interested in bringing a motion forward. The first question would be just to piggyback onto Councillor Salih's questions about the overall structure as we move forward. If you can give us a sense of how you see that implementation body structure being pulled together. We talk about being inclusive, community-wide. What would that look like? And in terms of your best case scenario, I imagine it wouldn't be political appointees as chairs. And can you speak about that as well?
So sort of building on what we already said around the process. So I imagine it would be going back out to the 200 champions that we already engaged, as well as a call to the larger community, and letting it be known that this process is going forward, and what the actual details of selecting those people and whatnot would look like. I think it would as Ms. Wilcox said, that's still entirely to be decided, but given the conversations that the steering committee has had thus far, getting to this point around the implementation body structure, we would definitely want it to be representative of the diversity of our community. That would be a priority, but alongside of that, recognizing that there are certain skills and experience that would need to go alongside of that. So holding both of those in hand and really making sure that the process reflects the equitable nature of CDIS and actually can, be held to that kind of standard.
Second question, if I could, before I bring a motion forward. Can you give us a sense, just more broadly, about the position, the Indigenous relations position? This is something I'm really excited about. I didn't think that we'd come, and I know it's been over 150 years, but I didn't think that we'd come this far, this fast to see a recommendation like this during this term of council, and I'm excited about the possibility, particularly because we've identified a source of funding that would allow us to pilot the position for a couple of years.
I'm going to let Ms. Wilcox answer that, but before I do, I just want to say that around that specific piece, not only through the CDIS process, but through the Diverse Voices for Change project through the city, it was one of the major recommendations that came forward and was reinforced. So
in terms of the position, we have identified a source of funding, as is noted in the report, that being the EEE Reserve. And as you have noted, it would be piloted over the next 2 years leading up to the multi-year budget. In terms of when we look at the landscape of what is happening in other municipalities, we certainly aren't unique. There are many other communities that have similar type positions. So we have been looking to those communities such as Edmonton, Calgary, Hamilton, Toronto. There are many, many others, and looking to those communities and the way they have defined those roles. I think there are a number of ways to approach it. So right now we're in the process of defining where it lands to meet the needs of the London community and our First Nation neighbors. But some communities define it as akin to a government and external relations role, where it's focused on building relationships and capacity within the organization and expertise so that you can standardize processes and sort of experiences across an organization. Some have it at a service level in the development of how services are delivered. So we are at this point assessing all of those and we are not in a position yet where we have that fully defined, but we would be working to do that and to hopefully begin recruitment early in the new year.
And just one final follow-up question, Chair, before I make my statement. I imagine that this is being done in full consultation with Indigenous leaders from our community. The intention is that if we're to move in this direction and you receive this positive direction, that this will be defined very much in a collaborative way, and this is not a city-led initiative, for example. This is one that would be developed with our Indigenous communities.
Through the chair. Yes, absolutely. So at this point, we are very early on, as noted in the process. We've identified the source of funding and are working through what those next steps might be and sort of general parameters. And yes, it would be a consultative and collaborative process focused on collaboration as we move forward.
Okay, thank you, Chair. If I could just move a motion and maybe I'll move the motion at the end of my remarks. This is really impressive work, and this has not been easy. I attended each of the meetings when our 200 plus community members came together and developed these strategies. These aren't our strategies that were developed within the walls of City Hall. These are the community strategies. This isn't our vision. This is the community's vision. And these aren't our priorities. These are the community's priorities. And I think that we share them. We've endorsed them. And that's the way that we break down barriers, particularly when it comes to systemic barriers, is we accept that we bring bias and privilege into situations and that we need to reach out to many different members of our community to come up with solutions to affect positive change. With regard to the stipend, I'm supportive of the $2,000 stipend for each of the leadership individuals. I think about barriers in a number of ways that sometimes we don't even see them, and you spoke about this during your remarks. The reason why I'm in this position today is because I joined a group called the Strengthening Neighborhoods Task Force 10 years ago. And we met 12 times for hours in the evening, and the only reason, hey Cheryl, I was able to participate in this was because there was childminding. And so my then 3-year-old had a place to be while I was contributing to developing this program. And actually, my newborn arrived during the process, and there was a place for him as well. I think that that's really important to recognize, that there are barriers come in all different shapes and sizes. And if your leadership team thinks that this $2,000 stipend will help address that, then I'm very much willing to support it. I think that that's a very positive investment. I also reflect back to my days in the Strengthening Neighborhoods Task Force. It was 140 community members from all, at the time, 42 different neighborhoods across London came forward to a committee just like this. And there were 5 of us, and we'd volunteered our time for a year, and we brought forward the ideas that developed the Strengthening Neighborhoods strategies that is now in its second phase. And I would be loath to do what happened to us when we were in that position. It really became almost micromanaged after really significant community work, grassroots work. And so I'm not going to do that either. I think that at this time, I will move recommendations A and B. I think that that's very important for us to do. If someone brings forward a C to refer back anything about the stipends or really anything here, I'll vote against it. If it passes, I still see that as positive because we're moving forward. But it's my intention, if there's a seconder, to move A and B, to send a really positive message back to our community that we've heard you, we're listening, we want to invest in this, and this is absolutely the direction to move forward in. So with that, I'll move the motion if there's a seconder for A and B.
Councillor Ridley is indicating that she will second that motion, and I will go to Councillor Squire.
My question is this. We're talking about a stipend, and I'm really concerned, not concerned, but I'm curious about whether we have consistency across the corporation in terms of other working groups, advisory committees. In other words, are stipends being paid to other people who are presently undertaking work on whether it's advisory committees or other working groups? Because my concern would be that I don't find it consistent to say, well, this particular working group is going to get a stipend. I'm not going to argue whether they deserve it or not. Probably they do. But what about all the other various volunteer groups where people come forward? Because on occasion we've heard from them saying, look, we have problems with childcare. We have problems with something else. So, I mean, my concern is if we do it for one working group, are we not going to be looking at having to do it for every working group where people provide time on behalf of the city, and there's a lot of them? Are they being paid now? I just don't know.
Thank you, and through the chair. In terms of those working groups that would be city-led, no, we did not have a precedent to go from when we were developing the structure and the functions of the steering committee, particularly around compensation. And I do not believe, clerk can correct me if I'm wrong, but the advisory committee members are not paid.
So I do have a difficulty with that, that we're going to say, okay, here's a particular group that we are going to provide the chairs of working groups with a stipend of $2,000. My question would be, if I'm spending hours and hours at City Hall providing advisory services or taking time away from my family on other important issues, why don't I get a stipend? So I can't, the way that I could support it is if we have a consistent across the board policy or approach with regard to paying stipends. I suspect we don't. So I think referring it back is a very good idea for that particular purpose, because I'm having a hard time sitting here justifying, well, here's a group we're going to pay a stipend to, and here's another group that's doing really good work and we're not going to pay a stipend to.
Councillor Ridley?
Thank you. I was a little bit surprised by your answer, Ms. Wilcox, and I'm trying to Google quickly while I chat, because we have a committee of adjustment, and I believe that the chair of the committee of adjustment receives a stipend. I don't know if you have that information to comment on that.
Through the chair, I'm not sure on the answer to the Committee of Adjustment, but in terms of my response, just solely looking at working groups apart from the sort of formalized structure of council committees.
So on speaking with the clerk, Councillor Ridley, I understand that the Committee of Adjustment meets once a week. That's the only difference between them and the other advisory committees, working groups, et cetera. But you have the floor.
Okay, so thank you. My point there was, because I struggled with this too, when I learned this, because I have the same question. I say we have a lot of committees that do really valuable work, and how do we provide a stipend or an honorarium to the chair of one committee and not the other. But I did recall that the Committee of Adjustment, all members get a stipend, and actually the chair gets a more significant stipend than the sitting members. And so in this case, I think we're just looking at the chairs. I think that it's a new committee. I think that it's something that is worth looking at in a broader context, but I don't think it's without precedent. And I think that the work that we're going to be doing with a brand new committee, kind of onboarding this level of work, where you don't have 20 years of experience and reports to go back and say, well, what did we do last time something similar came up? I think that the work is going to be extensive enough that I did make the decision that I could support the stipend, and it is just for the chairs and not for all of the members. And I recognize the additional work that goes into that. So that's why I agreed to second the motion. I also thought I would make a couple quick comments in regards to the appointment of the chairs. And I don't believe in any of our other committees, including the Committee of Adjustment, the council appoints the chairs. I think that is best done within the committee itself, because they're the ones that are in the room. They know how things are working. They know who is that collaborator, the person that can, keep the conversation going, and who's there. And so if that came forward, it's not something that I would be interested in supporting. I think the people that are around the table are in the best position to make those choices. And I think that we get ourselves into a bit more trouble when we continue to make political appointments. And sometimes I'm making decisions just based on names. I don't know the person. I don't know what their work style is like. And so I think the people that are doing the work with those members are in the better position to do that. So I just wanted to comment on that in case a subsequent motion comes up regarding that. It's not something that I see myself supporting. I think that there is some precedent for this. I think this is a new direction we're going. I think it's late. Something we should have been working on for quite a while now. I remember in 2015 going to Edmonton and learning about a lot of the work that they were doing, and I came back here and I started having some of those conversations here saying, why aren't we further along and where we should be, and here's what I saw there that I think we should start implementing here or start looking at here. So I'm glad that we are finally moving in the right direction, and I think that we're still going to have a lot of work to do, so I'm excited to see what comes out of some of this work moving forward.
Thank you, Councillor. I have Councillor Sully, then Usher, then Squire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair. And the first question I had is just a follow-up to Councillor Ridley's comment about the chair piece. My question was, I guess, just to clarify. So the person who is selected will be from the implementation body. The implementation body will come from people who already have been champions and who have. Just to clarify, just to help me out here again, just for clarity, if someone could just touch on that real quick.
Just in terms of recruitment, so we would go back to the champions, but it would also come from the larger community. People would not be, anybody could apply to be a part of it is the basic.
Perfect, thank you. So that's what I meant. So what I meant is those people who would be, just to clarify for Councilor Ridley, it wasn't the chair that I was saying we're going to pick the chair of that committee, but it was just the body that would eventually potentially one of those people being, receiving the compensation. So like we've appointed the members of DIAC, we've appointed the members of Committee of Adjustment. So I think right now what it looks like is the mayor has moved the motion. It's been seconded to have A and B, and what I'm put in a position today to do would have to be to vote against B, because my concern is I want to ensure that we are the ones who are deciding who will be on this implementation body, to ensure that we can have Because whoever is appointed on there, you know, it's gonna be a reflection of us. I'm not sure that's gonna be. I'm sure this could be good intent, but sometimes things don't always work as perfectly as planned. And then it comes back to this council's responsibility saying, you guys didn't make sure things went. And I didn't want to be in a position of them saying, here's 5 names, and us saying, no, none of these names are, you know, meet the criteria, send it back. And, you know, I think that becomes more problematic. So those are some of the reservations I have. And so like, I can't move forward if you're asking me to not allow us to have a say as the elected officials, to say these are the people who we think should be the voices on this implementation body, especially when you're asking them for compensation. And I understand the need and the merit behind wanting to compensate folks. But at the same time, there's many other places where we need diverse lenses, and those barriers and the compensation piece, the motive for it is to allow those people to engage and be a part of it, where we need people to be on those bodies, because then it would help in creating a more inclusive city hall and inclusive city altogether. So I think when I heard Councillor Squire talking about wanting to see more of a holistic approach, I think how I interpret that was making sure that if that is a barrier that does exist, let's talk about that right here, right now, or let's have that conversation on corporate services versus just doing it here on this one instance and maybe helping for this little, this one area, but not necessarily addressing the bigger picture and the bigger issue. And then we just avoid that, because in the past, all we continue to do a lot of times is just fix things in piecemeal. If we just stop and look at it from a bird's eye view and just say, okay, there's an issue, let's address it, let's talk about it and go at it once and for all, versus just saying, we'll do it one time here. And then that's all that happens for this time. And then the barriers still remain for those other committees. For example, the barrier will remain for people choosing to serve on DIAC because they're not compensated. And maybe is that something that should be considered? I don't know. But for those members then, do they say, their wealth and their experience that they're putting forward, does that mean all the work that they're doing shouldn't be compensated necessarily, that chair, even though they maybe work just as hard or maybe even more harder than the new implementation body may or may not be. So those are just some of my thoughts. So I'll leave the comments for now.
Councillor Usher.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't anticipate that this would go this elaborate. So I'm going to try to ask a question and then I'm going to make a few comments, because personally, I think that I'm seeing this going out of context. We have through you, Madam Chair, we have a CDIS committee, of which these 5 chairs will be part of that committee, along with some other people.
Are you asking if the current committee would still exist or a new committee?
Somewhere in here, you talked about these 5 chairs plus some other people being a part of the CDIS. And we'll let CDIS have a chair.
So if I can just jump in, Councillor, I'll go to you, Ms. Wilcox. But so there was a community diversity and inclusion strategy, which was made up of community champions, and as many as 200 people participated in this. And they came up with an implementation plan, which is what is before us today. And so there will be 5 working tables, which will work on the 5 priorities. They may or may not be people who participated in developing the strategy itself. So possibly, most likely, people that were community champions and involved in creating the strategy and developing an implementation plan will form the different working tables. And then from those working tables, there will be a chair of each one. But go ahead, Ms. Wilcox. Okay.
Clarify myself. Under the proposed implementation body, it says the CDIS leadership table will be made up of 10 members. That's what I'm talking about. 3 City of London staff, 1 chair from each of the 5 working group, 1 representative from DIAC, and 1 representative from ACCSC. So that sounds like a team that will coordinate everything else and bring it to council. Am I right?
through the chair, yes, that's correct. So that would be the leadership table, as is called in the report, would be comprised of 10 individuals. 5 of those would be community members who were, through the selection process, are chairing the individual working groups.
So what I'm seeing then is that got these 10 people who will be an overall umbrella, and somebody will have to chair that, facilitate it, whatever you want to call it. But here is this person, and then here are these 5 with a whole lot of other people, and these 5 are going to be getting $2,000 per year. My concern was that I don't know how that's going to play out with all these other people, but when you compare this with all the advisory committees that we have, who for years work very hard, who, by the way, select their own chair. We select the committee, and they select the chair, and they change the chair perhaps every year. They're not getting any honorarium or stipend, whatever we want to call it. None of them are. What do we call it, this committee? The Committee of Adjustment is a totally different type of committee. It's not an advisory committee. It makes specific decisions that we don't change, that affects the corporation. So they're totally different, and they get a stipend, but we should not be making comparison of this with them. I think that the comparison here should be with the chair of all the advisory committees who do not get a stipend. So I just want you to think about that before you make this decision, because I have concern about making this honorarium, although I quite appreciate and understand the time, effort that has to be spent. I've been there, so I know, but that's my say.
Councillor Squire and then Councillor Helmer.
I have to say that Councillor Salee captured my thoughts really, really precisely. That I think it's at our peril if we say we're going to pay an honorarium to this committee and leave our advisory committees. I know what I would say if I was on an advisory committee putting in hours on important issues. I would suggest that I would be entitled to the same treatment, equal treatment as other committees. And I agree with Councillor Usher. The Committee of Adjustment is quite different. It's statutorily required. It's a quasi-judicial body. It operates outside of the purview of council. But let me, the other thing is, there seems to me to be another committee, when we did the poverty panel report, and then it was sent out, there was a budget provided, and I don't know how that's going to interact. In other words, you've indicated earlier, well, there's going to be some budget asks related to this committee. So, I mean, why wouldn't stipends and all of those sort of things be included in that budget ask? Because if that committee says, look, we need this much to operate, and we give it to them, then I suppose it's justifiable to say, well, now that committee, if it wants to use money as it does, well, I suppose that makes some sense. But right now, I'm just from an issue of fairness and equal treatment between all the committees that serve council, I just can't provide a stipend at this stage to just one committee. Although it's not an issue of whether they deserve it or whether they'll be working hard. I just know that a lot of those other committees, including the Accessibility Committee, which is a statutorily required committee, I doubt they're being paid stipends. Perhaps I'm wrong. So I'm with Councillor Salee on this, and we'll support his amendment, and perhaps we can get it back and maybe serve our advisory committees better and put to rest some of these issues that I think they've been struggling with. In other words, how do they, when they're sacrificing time away from their jobs and their families, how do they make up that compensation? I'd like to have, as Councillor Salee says, let's have a larger discussion and let's do it correctly.
Councillor Helmer.
I'm glad that Councillor Squire brought up the London for All implementation body, because when I read this report, I thought, wow, this is a bargain for only $10,000 a year. We can have an implementation body that's going to be working on this strategy, making sure that we get good reporting on what kind of progress is being made. And that's basically 1/10, not even, of the cost of the implementation body, which is $125,000. To United Way as the lead agency. I thought that was good use of money. I supported it at the time. I know not everybody did. But I think that was appropriate. It's a big strategy, that one. It required a lot of work. I think it needed a backbone agency to kind of lead that work, but it has a lot of tables related to it. And if we can accomplish a similar amount of work scaled down to the size of what's in the recommendations from CDIS for just $10,000 a year, I think that would be very great. I think we probably will be looking at other costs to support that work, and so I don't want to think it's just going to be $10,000, but I think it's appropriate. And I think that we have different bodies to do different things. And I know we get these reports every year about who receives remuneration from the positions that we have appointed people to. Since we're talking about it, I thought I would just remind everybody, of course, the members of the Police Service Board receive compensation, the members of the Transit Commission. The chair gets an additional stipend on top of what the other appointed members receive, and it's the Transit Commission who chooses the chair, right? And so there's certainly precedent. This happens for the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority as well. Many of the agencies, boards, and commissions where we're appointing people, they choose their own chairs, and the chairs get stipends on top of whatever the other members are receiving. So I'm not sure about this fairness argument. This is not an advisory committee. This body we're setting up is not an advisory committee, so I don't think it should be treated as though it's an advisory committee, and I don't have any issues with trying something new. I also don't have any problems with trying something new to see if it works better, and being able to do one thing before we do everything. I don't think we have to do everything. I think sometimes that's how systemic barriers get reinforced. You say, well, I'm not changing anything unless we change everything. I don't think that's a good idea. And I would say to my colleague, Councillor Salih, that that's probably not a great idea. I think we should just let it go and see if this way is better. Because I know that being able to pick the people and decide who's going to be on them, I think I can see the rationale for wanting to be involved in that decision. I think we probably need to change things if we want things to change. Right, and not keep trying to do everything the same the way we have been doing them. So I think I've learned over time that listening really carefully to the recommendations that are coming from the community members is a good idea when it comes to an issue like the things we're dealing with in CDIS. I am the kind of person who wants to kind of micromanage things and change them and make them exactly the way I think that they should be. I'm not going to do that. On this particular one, I think I'm just going to go with what is being recommended by the group who's been working on it for so long. I would like to see how that goes, and if we need to make adjustments, I think if we approach it with that kind of attitude, we can make improvements if there are areas where we can improve. So I will support what's being recommended by the folks who've been working on CDIS to this point.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. I have Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer. And I'm glad a couple of people have brought up the work of the Poverty Panel, and because I see a lot of similarities in how these strategies came about by working directly with the community and directly with the people affected by systemic barriers, by racism, by exclusion and oppression. And so the Poverty Panel dealt and worked directly with people experiencing poverty, both past and present. And as Councillor Helmer rightly pointed out, we did create an gave direction that an implementation body be created, very similar to the structure that this community is recommending. And we did provide a budget to the United Way to be the lead organization to see to the creation of that implementation body. And I know that the United Way provides a stipend to people participating in the working tables to implement the Poverty Panel recommendations. And the reason they provide a stipend to these individuals participating is because people living in poverty face barriers preventing their participation. And this is something that is happening in poverty reduction strategies across the country, and was a direct recommendation from the late Pam McConnell, who was Deputy Mayor of Toronto and who oversaw the poverty reduction strategy there. She highly recommended that as we move forward, we consider providing compensation so that people who lived in poverty would be active members and involved in implementing the strategies. I was very happy to speak to Ms. Smith the other day and hear about members of the implementation body for the poverty reduction strategy here in London, the London for All plan, participating in a conference put on by Tamarack. And these kinds of conferences, cities often provide means so that people living in poverty can participate in these conferences. So they come from across the country with different experiences. And they were amazed at what's going on in London. They spoke to people from different cities, spoke to the people who are involved with the implementation body coming from London, and amazed to hear that they are the decision makers. They're sitting on these leadership tables. So this relates directly to the work of this community here in London, working on the community diversity and inclusion strategy. These are their recommendations, and we know from the work we've done in poverty, in homelessness, Indigenous issues, that these people face barriers that you and I do not face. And even speaking to Councillor Usher and Councillor Salih, as a white woman, I don't and have never experienced the barriers that you face in everyday life. I want to give an example of a difference, if we're going to compare to advisory committees, a difference between the people on this working group or in this implementation body compared to, say, EPAC, an advisory committee that doesn't get compensated. We know from the work, statistics that we've looked into and studied, comparing the makeup of our advisory committees to the general population in London. EPAC, as an example, is overrepresented compared to our general population in PhDs and white males. So they are a completely different body compared to the people that will be working on these working tables. I think it's completely appropriate. I know as well the work that I've done with Indigenous communities in London and with First Nations that are our neighbors, that a barrier to their participation, their more active participation is financial, is often a financial barrier. So, as I said, I will be supporting the motion that's on the floor, and I will not be supporting any kind of move to refer this in any way. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Cassidy. Councillor Salih, did I see your hand? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I don't want to just keep going on in this conversation, but it's an important conversation. I know there's many things to be said, but just to clarify again, I know there was reference to the advisory committees, and you know, some of them getting paid, the London Police Service Board, the LTC, I know all of that, but again, they are appointed by either the province or by the City of London. So what I'm saying is there is a piece that's missing here, is that city staff or whoever is going to pick those people to be part of that implementation body, and the city council, the elected officials who are accountable to the public, aren't making those decisions to ensure we have you know, the most reflective group in some of those pieces. I don't expect our city staff to be experts on, you know, in these pieces and on these fronts, but also we have to recognize that if we're talking about institutional barriers and institutional racism and the institutions that exist, sometimes, you know, people from outside of City Hall who don't have relationships, who don't know people here, come to elected officials and have conversations with us and say, these are these challenges, and we can have these conversations with them that they might not necessarily feel like they can have with staff for whatever may be multiple reasons. So that's why I'm hoping that, you know, that we can have that motion to come back on that piece, because the alternative would be essentially for me to vote against the B, which isn't how I genuinely feel, but it just comes down to ensuring that city council remains responsible for that decision-making of who is the appointed to this body that is going to do some incredible work. And I think we have that responsibility that I don't want to necessarily give away. Not to say that staff couldn't do a great job or not, but I know that I'm responsible for my constituents, and I know I've heard from people. I know people who've even engaged in this process have come to me in the past week and have expressed that they want to see the piece of the process done a little bit differently, and that's from members of the public, and that's from members who have participated in this piece. So that's why I'm just advocating and bringing those pieces forward. So I guess my alternative is to put that motion to refer that piece. I guess that will fail. Doing the math real quick, because it seems to be me and Squire, so I'll move it and then go from there.
Councillor Ridley. I'll go ahead.
Thank you. I think I'm perhaps fundamentally understanding the selection of the chair differently than my colleague. And so right now I'm looking at Appendix B, page 132. If you want to go to section 4, I think what's not clear here, and I'm looking at the third paragraph from the bottom, it says chairs will be chosen based on the individual's expertise on the subject matter and the individual's ability to support the implementation. So what I've heard from the presentation is that we're going to do a broad call, and anyone who wants to be involved with CDIS can be involved. And I think what I hear Councillor Solis saying is, you know, that the understanding of who is selecting the chairs isn't clear, and it's not in the appendix. So my understanding based on the presentation, my conversations, was that the chairs would be selected by the committee members, which is in line with what we do with other advisory committees. So I guess I'm looking to the presenters for clarification on that and perhaps a willingness to amend Appendix B. I'm very okay with the groups themselves selecting or electing their chairs from their own body. I think that's the way that it should be. And so I don't know if that was the intent of this or if we need a minor modification to this appendix, and if that would make my colleague a little bit more at ease as well.
I think that was the intention, and based on the conversations that the steering committee had in terms of putting this together, I think that they would be in favor of that.
So I'm going to look to my colleague and see where I did hear that you said, I believe it should be political or people who are accountable. What I'm hearing from the direction of the program is that this is broad. Anyone can join it. Within those groups, people will subdivide into their interest areas. And within those groups, they will elect their own chair. And that's the person who would be entitled to receive the honorarium. And so that's what I'm hoping that we're moving forward. And I don't know if that puts my colleague at ease at all.
And Madam Chair, I think that was a question, so I'll try to answer that. So from what so it's a call out letter, but I thought then staff were gonna pick from that call out letter. So that's not necessarily the case. It's gonna be, so if 5,000 people show up, all 5,000 people can be a part of it. Is that what you're getting at? I know I just threw a big number, but I'm just trying to be very clear.
Will you be limiting the number of people on each working table?
It was not the intention to limit.
Okay, so I'm just trying to picture how this works. And again, I apologize to my colleagues on committee for the questions. So from those bodies, then people will make suggestions and move forward a name at some point, and then will that name then come back to committee, I guess? Is that my understanding, or?
That's not what's on the floor right now. Mayor Brown.
Just trying to understand clearly what is on the floor. I know that a member of the committee moved to referral. I'm not sure if it was seconded. I don't know if we need to continue in this line of discussion or if it's time to make a decision.
We were discussing. Councillor Sully indicated that perhaps he might move a referral. I was going to but he had also indicated that he had done the math. So it was sort of up in the air in my mind whether or not he was going to move a referral, considering that he had done his math. At this point, Mayor Brown, your motion is on the floor, which is the staff recommendation. And it was seconded by Councillor Ridley. And not seeing any further discussion. Councillor Ridley?
Thank you. And I know that staff and those presenting the report have heard, but I think it's worthwhile to make a change to that appendix to say chairs will be elected. And so I would like to add that within it being noted that Appendix B will be changed to reflect the election of chairs by the committee members.
I believe the mayor is indicating that that is a friendly amendment, just to provide absolute clarity in Appendix B that the chairs will be selected by the members of the individual working tables. And the clerk is working on that. Councillor Sully.
So I'll vote on the referral, see if there's a seconder, and then just to move us forward, and then we'll deal with the next piece.
Do I have a seconder for the referral? Okay. The clerk is just working on some wording here. Councillor Sully, would you just be referring Part B? Because A is receipt.
Correct, so I don't know if I could just pick apart from Part B, or it would have to be the entirety of it, so it's just specific to the compensation in the process.
So Councillor Sully, your options could be refer all of A, or tell me exactly what you want to refer back to staff.
Just the compensation in the process, the selection process, the appointment
The
process.
selection, the process to select the chair and the honorarium. So Councillor Sully is moving that we refer back the portion of the implementation strategy dealing with the honorarium and the selection of the chairs. And Councillor Squire is seconding that referral. So the clerk will work on that wording now. Go ahead, Councillor Ridley.
Thank you. I thought it might be more efficient if I use this time to speak to it while the clerk works out the wording rather than waiting for that. I'm going to vote against it. I think that that's probably clear based on my previous remarks. You know, we don't select chairs of other committees. We're doing this as a broad base. I would say this is probably the most widespread engagement in terms of committee members that we've done in my experience. I think that this process is going to allow as many people who want to be as active as they can be on the committees to do so, which I think is a good thing. I don't think that City Council should be encumbered with really, whether you want to say getting into the weeds or micromanaging or whatever in terms of approving the chair that's selected by their peers and their colleagues on those committees. And I don't think we do it for the police board. I don't think we do it for the health unit. And we certainly don't do it for our advisory committees. Those committees make those selections. I hear very clearly what my colleagues have said in regards to compensation. I am not opposed to looking at honorarium, stipends, or expense coverages for other committees, but I think we need to keep that separate. I don't think that there's a need to stall moving this forward. I think that if my colleagues want to bring forward a motion to the next appropriate committee in terms of reviewing all of our advisory committees and providing compensation, then they should do that. But to hold up moving this forward based on that, I'm not going to support.
Sorry, I wasn't going to speak again, but again, it's just my motion is kind of being lost in what its intent. So I just wanted to make that very clear. My intent is to ensure that, you know, the City Council has some involvement with this process. I'm telling you, I've heard from people who have already said to me that they don't want to see it head in this direction, right? So I've heard from them and said, okay, well, what can I do? And so that's why I was hoping to get some feedback from staff on the process. I'm not saying that we're gonna be the ones to handpick X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying I want some options that maybe come up. I want some clarity about the compensation. These questions weren't answered until we asked the questions and we had these lengthy conversations. We're talking about $10,000. I know it might not seem like a significant amount of money, but it's still significant enough for me to want to have to answer these questions. And again, when we're talking about people in racialized communities, I want to make sure we are doing the best that we can. And I don't want people to be under the impression that, you know, this is going to solve everything and everything's going to be great, but I want to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence instead of necessarily feeling that I'm saying, okay, because at the end of the day, when people are upset and not happy with the product or where we're at in a year or two from now, they'll come to council. They won't come to the body or the CDIS and say, you failed. They will say, we failed. And rightly so, because we're the ones who need to be involved and have that piece. So that's why I just wanted to ensure. That's why I wanted to have a better understanding. I get it's unique, but it's not an advisory committee. And it's not trying to slow anything down. Believe me when I tell you, you know, if I hope no one is trying to infer that I'm trying to slow things down on this front, because I can tell you that's not the case, and that's not really cool of a language to use on this front. I'm just trying to make sure that I do the best job I can and understand the impacts and understand the realities that people who are visible minorities in our community face every single day. I get it, I understand it, but I want to do it right, and I want to do it with the best abilities I can, and I want to recognize the voices that I've heard from our community.
Okay, Counselor, my problem now is that your second is not in the room. I believe if the second has left the room, then the motion is not on the floor. Okay. So we don't have a second, so we'll move ahead with the original motion that was on the floor before referral. Yes, can we vote A and B separately, and the motion is separate, is reversed from what's in the report. So the first A is the endorsement part. So I'll call the question. So it doesn't say that? It says motion to approve Part A. So Part A is the next steps as outlined in this report, noted in be endorsed as the process for implementing and monitoring the CDIS.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I'm speaking and the microphone's not catching up. I'm just wondering, Part A on my agenda on page 116.
Yes, it's reversed, so the clerk is going to read the motion.
The motion for Part A is that on the recommendation of the Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy Steering Committee, the following actions be taken with respect to an update on the Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. A, the next steps as outlined in the staff report dated October 10th, 2018, be endorsed as the process for implementing and monitoring the CDIS. It being noted that Appendix B will be revised to indicate that the chairs of the steering committees will be elected by the members of the individual working groups. Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-1.
So now we'll vote on Part B, which is receiving the report and the information. Yes, Mayor Brown.
As the mayor of the motion, but really what I wanted to say was the mover of the motion. Can I say a few words? Go ahead. Thank you. I want to end this on a very positive note. We're receiving a report, but really what we're receiving is a tremendous amount of community work, and we're able to move that forward. And again, I'll reiterate that these strategies and priorities and ideas were not designed within the walls of City Hall. We reached out far and wide across our community after being challenged in a very direct way by our community to do so. And as we move to the last few weeks of this council, this is a really impressive and important direction that this committee is taking and that will be taken through council in a week's time. And so this is a proud moment for me to be able to vote for this, to be able to move this work forward, because I know that this is an area where we set a stage, we set a platform for great work to happen. We didn't have the answers, and now we're able to endorse that work and see it improve our community over a long period of time. The significant amount of work is still ahead, but this is a very positive step in my mind.
And with that, we'll vote. This is for receipt.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
So I want to thank you both for coming and also for the work that you did. I'm asking you to please pass my thanks and the thanks of this committee to the members of the community that have worked on this. I know I spoke specifically a number of times to Brian Hill, who's an Indigenous man who was involved in this, and he has given me like just a smidgen, a fraction of an idea of what he's lived with his whole life, dealing with racism in our community as an Indigenous man. And his final words to me were, "I still have hope." And so he was, I know, very proud of the work that he participated in on this, in this endeavor. And I know that our passing this today and hopefully next week at council will even build on the hope that he already has. So thank you, and thanks to staff that were involved in this as well. Thanks. And I'm chairing this committee, so I have to move on to item 5.1, which is the deferred matters list. Are there any comments, questions on that list? No, then I'll look for a mover for the deferred matters list. Moved by Councillor Ridley, and I'll second that, and we can vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-0.
So next we have a confidential matter that we will go in camera for. It's a personal matter pertaining to identifiable individuals, including municipal employees, with respect to the 2019 Mayor's New Year's Honors List. I'll look for a mover to go in camera. Moved by Councillor Sali, seconded by Councillor Ridley. We will adjourn in camera, just so everybody knows. And we need to vote on going in camera. Yeah, it's going to be on screen.
Closing the vote, motion carries 4-0.